Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden have a lengthy telephone conversation. And 9/11, 20 years on, how the terror attacks forever changed the United States and the world. Hello, I'm Einar Tangen, and this is The Heat. It's being described as a candid and in-depth conversation with global implications. President Xi accepted a phone call from President Biden on Thursday. The U.S. administration says the call was an effort to get the U.S.-China relationship back on track. Beijing said the two countries should cooperate on issues including climate change and economic recovery.
The international community is facing a lot of common challenges. China and the US should show broad visions, shoulder great responsibilities, look ahead, press forward, and demonstrate the strategic courage and political resolve to bring the China-US relationship back to the right track of stable development as soon as possible, for the good of the people of both countries and the world.
For more now on the China-US relationship, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Philadelphia, Neysun Mahboubi is a research scholar with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator based in Beijing, and Victor Gao is a chair professor at Soochow University and current affairs commentator based in Beijing. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Victor, the White House described this as a broad strategic discussion. The call was initiated by the United States. It's the second time that President Xi and President Biden have talked to each other since President Biden became president. What's going on here? Why the second call and why now?
Well, first of all, President Biden and President Xi Jinping knew each other well for more than 10 years. They met many times. President Xi Jinping, when he was the vice president of China, even accompanied Vice President Biden at the time, traveling to other cities in China. So for old friends who knew each other well, it is high time for them to reconnect. Secondly, I think both China and the United States are facing very difficult and challenging circumstances at home and abroad. So for China and the United States to compare notes and try to see how much they can get onto the same page, it is absolutely important. Then thirdly, I think the Chinese side and the American side have met many times before this important summit phone call. Preparations have been made, testing of the water has been done, and I think these two leaders can now start at a higher level to see how much promotion they can give to the better relations between these two countries. So it is mutually important, and I think the fact that they are talking to each other is much better than the two leaders did not pick up the phone and talk to each other.
What do you think the telephone call achieved, Victor?
Well, first of all, from the Chinese side, it's very important to see that President Biden has reaffirmed that the United States acknowledged the One China policy, which means that Taiwan is part of China. Now, this is the reddest of the red bottom line as far as China is concerned. China does not want to see the United States to do anything extraordinary to stand in the way of a unification of the Chinese mainland and Taiwan, because that will really push the situation to an abyss, unleashing the worst possible scenario between China and the United States and possibly for mankind. So this is very reassuring as far as China is concerned. Secondly, I think the two leaders talked about a broad range of issues, including those who have already been published, and I suppose many things that remain unpublished. And I think this is very important because these two leaders now can instruct their respective hierarchical bodies to pursue dialogue and communication with each other on a much better understanding of each other and Chinese side is now saying we need to really implement what has been agreed by the two supreme leaders of the countries to promote bilateral relations going forward.
Neysun Mahboubi, as Victor points out, these countries have a lot of differences, but there is one area where they want to cooperate and have been cooperating, and that's on climate change. But at the same time, Chinese officials have been pointing out that, look, it's unrealistic to expect close collaboration on this one issue while the United States continues to criticize us on a number of other issues. I mean, does this give us an indication of how difficult it is to get this reset done on the one hand, and just trying to have a point on that?
Well, I'm glad you brought the climate example because, of course, you know that John Kerry went to Tianjin last week to try to have conversations on climate, which the reporting seems to suggest did not go terribly well, and included the message that you just mentioned as well. And one of the things that the reporting suggests went into the Biden team wanting to set up this leader-to-leader call was a perception that maybe the meetings among the officials at a lower level weren't going so well, and it needed to be elevated to the leader-to-leader level, which they did last night. As to this argument that we can't cooperate on climate so long as we have other things we're disagreeing on, one of the problems with that argument is that both countries have their own domestic interest in solving this problem, which is already wreaking havoc. We've got pictures from my hometown of Philadelphia from not that long ago. We have pictures from the Chinese province of Henan from over the summer. At some level, both countries are going to have to try to find ways to mitigate this climate crisis. And if they can do it together, that's probably even better. But they're going to need to do that irrespective of whether they have disagreements on other issues. So to me, this notion of we can't work together on this issue that's going to cause problems for both of us unless, there's other conditions are met, it doesn't seem that persuasive to me.
So Neysun, of course, they will leave this to officials at the working group level to deal with these things. But do you think that sends a strong signal downwards that you've got to make some progress on this?
I mean, across the full range of issues, that would be the hope. We've had these meetings now. We've had the highest level of prominence. We've had the March meeting in Alaska. We had Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman's meeting, and in Tianjin as well in July, and then John Kerry's meeting. Those we were all wondering, were they more productive behind the scenes than was visible from the outside? And the fact that this leader-to-leader meeting was considered so important suggests that maybe they weren't. Now we have to see what happens next. And of course, we're also hoping to see if President Biden and President Xi will be able to meet in person at the G20 meeting that's coming up. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but there does seem to be this sense on the U.S. side, at least, that for there to be more progress made at the lower levels, President Biden and President Xi need to come to some kind of understanding.
Einar Tangen, President Xi laid it out very clearly and very succinctly in his statement. He said, when China and the United States cooperate, the two countries in the world will benefit. When China and the United States are in confrontation, the two countries in the world will suffer. What was your takeaway from the call?
Well, it's very simple. I mean, these two powers have to cooperate. It's not just climate change. The world is facing economic and health catastrophe with the handling of COVID-19 by, in particular, the U.S. On one hand, they're facing internal issues on it. On the other hand, they're not measuring up to their international responsibilities. So, and then you get into the economic field where it's going to be very, very dicey, especially for emerging nations who are saddled with debt, do not have vaccines, and are trying to patch their economies together with, very, very little help coming from the outside.
Victor Gao, there are, of course, significant obstacles in the way of good relations. The United States, for instance, has called on its European allies as well as its Asian allies to put pressure on China. Beijing also sees this call for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus as a smear campaign being initiated by the United States, and also sees it as a violation of its sovereignty. How big are these obstacles?
Indeed, these are very serious obstacles as far as China is concerned, because China insists that there is only one set of China-U.S. relations. You cannot pick and choose. You need to treat China-U.S. relations as an inherent whole, rather than treat climate change as one aspect and other bilateral issues as completely different thing. You can be friendly to China on one thing and hostile to China on the other things. So we want to have a more balanced and a more better structured China-U.S. relations. For the two issues you mentioned, of course, they are very, very serious. From the Chinese perspective, there is still the eagerness on the part of Washington to rally itself as well as its allies to form a united front of hostility and antagonism against China. But China firmly believes that this attempt is doomed to failure, either the United States by itself in its own capacity or together with its European or allies in other parts of the world.
Neysun, there are some Chinese analysts who say that the United States is keen to engage with China right now because there is pressure from the United States business community. Do you believe that to be the case?
There is a sense that the business community wants the relationship to be on a sure footing because both sides, but including U.S. business, have suffered. Even the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, has said that the U.S.-China relationship, having reached this point of great tension, has been bad for business. Whether the business community's lobbying of the Biden administration will be fully effective, we'll have to wait and see. It was just reported in the Wall Street Journal today that the USTR's China trade review is nearing a completion, and one outgrowth of that may be a new Section 301 investigation on China's subsidies practices, which is going even further in the direction of the approach that they took to tariffs under the Trump administration. Now, that could all be just negotiating strategy. It could be posturing before next year's midterms. But it does at least illustrate that irrespective of the lobbying from the U.S. business community, there's still going to be a move from within the administration to take a tougher line. And how that plays out, we'll have to watch.
Einar, do you expect any movement in the short term on things like tariffs, as well as there's also been talk about military-to-military talks? I mean, could we see that?
Yeah, I think both are possible. I mean, inflation is looming. Biden has had a disastrous week or month with Afghanistan. The COVID war is not going very well. He's looking for some sort of economic daylight in order to buoy his chances in the midterms, and reducing the tariffs or getting rid of them entirely. Some sort of checkpoint Charlie game where, at stroke of midnight, both drop their tariffs would be good for all sides. Obviously, the military to military is necessary because, the U.S. in China's eyes has been ratcheting up tensions with these frequent freedom of navigation patrols through disputed areas and through the Straits of Taiwan. I mean, this you can't deny, but there's a kind of a passive-aggressive sense to many of this. I mean, you have to remember it was Biden who called Xi in February because he wanted to make sure he understood that the U.S. was not in decline. It was the U.S. who initiated the Anchorage meeting, which China came to, although it was not in a third party's site. It was on U.S. soil. And the same with Tangen, which was kind of a last moment thing. Now you have this phone call, after the debacle in Afghanistan. And it seems that the U.S. is trying to be a bit passive aggressive. On one hand, they're initiating contacts. At the other hand, there's almost this daily drumbeat of why China is just a terrible country.
Victor, there's long been a feeling among Chinese officials that this is not about a competition between the two countries. This is about the United States trying to contain China's rise. What needs to happen to dispel that notion?
Well, first of all, I personally even do not believe that China and the United States are competing with each other. I believe the United States still considers itself to be the top dog in the world, and China has no desire to become the next top dog or replacing the United States of becoming the next top dog. That's a very important philosophical point that the American decision makers need to be fully aware. Whether the Chinese economy is still rising and eventually will overtake of that of the United States, of course, that's the megatrend of our time.
Okay.
And decision makers in Washington need to come to terms with that megatrend.
Right.
But does that mean that China will become the next top dog of the world? No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think philosophically we need to deal with those theories like destined to war, proposed by a professor at Harvard, and the 100-year marathon, which is completely false and wrong.
Yeah, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thanks to all of you for being with us.
Thank you.
We turn now to 9/11, that awful day in September 2001 when the United States was hit with terror attacks in one of the worst tragedies in the nation's history. Almost 3,000 people were killed in the al-Qaeda terrorist strikes in New York, at the Pentagon just outside Washington, D.C., and in a hijacked plane that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The impact is still being felt in the United States and other parts of the world. I talked about that with author and journalist Chris Hedges. He is a former Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times and was part of an investigative team that won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on global terrorism. He joins us from Princeton, New Jersey. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us. You were in New York on the morning of 9/11/2001. That was a massive blow to the United States, the first major attack since Pearl Harbor. How difficult was it for Americans to accept that something like this could happen on U.S. soil?
Very difficult if you weren't black. The great blues artist Willie King, because they were hyping this as the worst act of terrorism in American history, and of course likening it to Pearl Harbor, and he wrote this wonderful, stayed up all night and wrote this blues song saying, "I've been terrorized all my days." But certainly for white Americans, it was a shock. The city was in shock. Remember that when the plane went into the first tower, the supposition was that the pilot had had a heart attack, or it was an error, or off course, or lost control of the plane. But when the second plane hit the tower, the remaining tower, which I watched on the Jumbotron screen in Times Square, it was very clear. And then the entire city, and perhaps much of the country, but certainly the city, went into a state of collective shock. People didn't know if there would be another strike. They didn't know where it would be. They wondered if they were safe. They didn't what did it mean? Who would do this? Why would they do this? So yes, it was a tremendous jolt to the American psyche.
And the U.S. response to the attacks would have a massive impact, not just here in the United States, but around the world as well, with the war on terror that followed. I mean, but let's look at the domestic impact to start with. We had the rise of nationalism, Islamophobia, and of course the massive surveillance and domestic programs, which began at that point, that people like Edward Snowden told us about. As you look back now, how much did that day fundamentally change America?
I think it changed America tremendously, although we were already creeping towards this kind of overreach in terms of state control. The executive branch of government, I mean, the Congress under the Constitution declares war, but I think the last war that the Congress declared was in Vietnam, and then of course they were lied to by Lyndon Johnson about the Tonkin Gulf incident. So we were headed in that direction, but this kind of pushed us over the cliff. You had the Bush administration push through the 2002 authorization to use military force act, which essentially allowed the executive branch to declare war after war after war. I think in terms of conflicts now, we're certainly up over a dozen. I think the full number may be 17. And this is just at the whim of the executive branch of government. As you correctly pointed out, this saw wholesale surveillance of the American public. It saw a series of laws passed, terrorism laws, and Muslims have been targeted under this, where under SAMs, these are special administration measures, you don't even know what you're being charged with. That's secret evidence. If there is evidence, it's not available to the defendant or the defense lawyers. It has seen an explosion in terms of the military budget and the stocks, of course, of the defense industry. Yes, I would say 9/11 was a very seminal point in U.S. history, not least of which because with the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and then the subsequent attempts to expand those conflicts into Syria, into Libya, parts of Pakistan, Somalia. I would argue that it's probably the greatest strategic blunder in American history, characteristic of dying empires that seek to recapture a lost hegemony through very foolish military adventurism.
Yeah, and on the Afghanistan war, according to the Cost of War Project, America's overall war on terror cost $8 trillion and caused 900,000 deaths. 40 million people were displaced in these wars, and those numbers that I'm citing there are on the conservative side. These were open wars of vengeance. Was it in any way justified?
No. First of all, you can't fight terrorist groups or terrorists through conventional wars. And the whole notion of a war on terror is a tautology. You can't make a war on terror. The way to defeat terrorists and terrorist groups is to isolate them within their own society. And the tragedy is that I immediately reported on the hijackers. I'm an Arabic speaker, so after 9/11, I was sent. They were living for a while in Paterson, New Jersey, outside of Newark. I went to the neighborhoods where they were living, interviewed their neighbors, tried to build profiles of them as much as was possible, and then was sent overseas, based in Paris, where I covered al-Qaeda in Europe and in the Middle East. So I was in the Middle East almost immediately after 9/11. And throughout the Muslim world, there was feelings of great repugnance among the vast majority of Muslims at this crime against humanity that had been carried out in the name of Islam. Now, if we had had the foresight and perhaps even the courage to build on that empathy, we would be far safer and more secure today than we are. Instead, we reacted from these primal feelings of hate and vengeance and nationalism. And remember, the flip side of nationalism is always racism. It's about the elevation of us and the denigration of the other. And that, of course, resurrected al-Qaeda in the same way that the long occupation of Afghanistan resurrected the Taliban. We spoke to the rest of the world exclusively in the language of violence, and that proved to be immensely self-defeating.
To what extent did that initial invasion of Afghanistan and then the subsequent war against Iraq lead to the kind of military adventurism that we see from the United States now?
Well, because nothing kept working, so we kept expanding. The demonization of Iran. Remember that when they went into Iraq, of course, as everyone knows, had nothing to do with 9/11. In fact, there was a great deal of hostility between al-Qaeda and the very secular, if brutal, regime of Saddam Hussein. But the feeling was that Afghanistan would be dealt with very quickly, and we could go into Iraq, and democracy, or at least our version of American puppet democracy, would emanate outwards from Baghdad throughout the Middle East, and bring down the regime or the government in Tehran. In fact, of course, all of the goals, the initial goals after 9/11 that were used to justify going into Afghanistan or going into Iraq, eventually going into Syria, going into Libya, essentially became inverted. So we reach a point where we are funding jihadists, many of whom were in Iraq, attacking American troops in an attempt to overthrow the Assad regime. Iraq as a unified country was splintered, and in fact, the Sunni insurgency in Iraq was only beaten back because of Iranian intervention in terms of support, in terms of Shia militias, and in terms of Iranian volunteers and Iranian troops. There was a kind of tacit alliance between the American forces and Iran. And what we've seen now is a Shia-dominated Iran, 60% of Iraq, 60% of Iraq is Shia, which has close ties to Tehran. We've actually increased the footprint, the reach, and the power of the Iranian regime throughout the Middle East. It was a complete debacle in of course, Syria. We resurrected the very groups that had been pushed to the margins in Iraq, including arming them up to the tune of, I think it was $500 million worth of weapons that were pumped in there with no kind of accountability. So they opened a kind of Pandora's box, which always happens in war. These centrifugal forces of war, in the end, control you. You don't control it, and that's precisely what happened.
I want to talk now a little bit about what has happened to the media in the United States over the past 20 years. You've been very critical of the media in the aftermath of 9/11, and especially in the run-up to the Iraq War. If we look at the media right now, especially television, we see that its studios are filled with generals and security agents right now. Has the media in the United States effectively become part of the security state, doing its bidding?
Yes, and I mean, this was what was frustrating. So I had been, as you mentioned, the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I'd spent 7 years in the Middle East, months of my life in Iraq. I understood that the whole premise of the invasion of Iraq, like the invasion of Afghanistan, was based on falsehoods. The Taliban was quite willing to negotiate. We forget this. And yet, because I didn't parrot the dominant narrative, in fact, spoke out against the war, I was pushed out of the media landscape and replaced by precisely the kind of figures that you mentioned that are still on the media, the people who created the debacle that we're in. I mean, the idea that John Bolton, for instance, is now holding forth on the airwaves, or Brennan, a former CIA director, or Petraeus, who oversaw at one point both the quote-unquote surges, which were largely a media gimmick, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the list goes on from there, while the people who actually understood what was happening and foresaw where all of this was going remain locked out. And that's because the media, as you correctly point out, is essentially surrendered to the national security state and become a full partner in it. You know, that gets into the breakdown of the media in the United States, which has essentially become silos, where you have like Fox News catering to one demographic and MSNBC or the New York Times catering to another. But on national security issues, there's no daylight between them.
Chris Hedges, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And that's it for this special edition of The Heat. CGTN will be bringing you lots of reporting on 9/11 in the coming days, including extensive online coverage. Thanks for being with us.